Similar to what we see in Africa, the arts of Oceania and the indigenous people there have often been misunderstood, sometimes intentionally, or their art has been suppressed or even just ignored without malicious intent because it was seen as less important and not quote unquote art by European colonialist forces. Another similarity between Oceanic cultures and African cultures is that the influence of the ancestors is often very important. Among Australian Aboriginal cultures, the ancestors are said to reside in a place called Dreamtime, and Dreamtime is a space outside of our kind of normal, everyday, day-to-day life. We might think of it as kind of next door, is how it's often explained. And the space of Dreamtime is inhabited by ancestor figures or figures that are supernatural. These figures are respected, but they're not worshipped as gods. And the representation of certain figures are often attached to certain groups or certain tribes within Australian Aboriginal culture. Probably the most famous example of this kind of interest in the ancestors is the Moai from what we call Easter Island. The Moai were quarried by the indigenous people that lived here, and then they were erected all over the island, many around the outside borders of the island. And when Europeans first encountered Easter Island, many of these figures were still standing. When they came back a couple hundred years later, they had all fallen and the people of Easter Island were no longer present, and they have since been re-erected. We often see a representation of the Moai in popular culture on TV and in the movies as just heads, but in fact every Moai we've seen actually has a body as well. Here again we see a non-naturalistic proportion where the heads are much larger than the bodies. And the bodies tend to be short and squat, particularly with very short legs. They often also seem to have had this kind of red scoria hat, like we see on the second figure from the right in this image, on at least some of the Moai. And recently scholars have made the argument that the eyes, rather than being this kind of deep insets that we often see today, were inlaid with shell or stone to make a more realistic iris and white and look more like a human eye. We believe that the Moai were intended to act as a kind of guardian figure and to watch over Easter Island, but they were also associated with the ancestors of the people that lived there. We think important individuals might have their own Moai carved, but that even if you were a relatively low-ranking individual, that you would have a clan Moai, where you could go and your soul or your spirit would reside after your death. We're not entirely sure because, again, there's so little information. We have relatively few documented sources about the people that actually made the Moai, of how these were carved. There's basically two broad theories of production. We do know the quarries where the stone came from, and they seem to have largely been carved in those quarries, pretty much directly where the stone was being harvested, and we know that because a lot of half-finished or partially finished examples are present there. However, there's two major theories about the workmen who made this. One is that this was a group of specialized craftsmen, similar to the blacksmiths that we talked about in the African Inkisi, and that these people, that was their role in society, is to carve the Moai. The other thought is that this would be a specialized role within the clan, and every clan would have an individual that was responsible for carving the Moai of that clan. Beyond who made them, it's not entirely clear how they were moved to the location that they're in. They are obviously quite large, as you've, again, probably seen in the movies or in popular culture, and there's several theories. One is that they were rolled on rollers, and actually one theory about the vanishing of the people of Easter Island states that they cut down all the trees on their island to make and move the Moai, and then with the lack of trees, they no longer had a sustainable ecosystem. Another theory is that they would be walked to their final destination, so that the bottoms of these are often slightly kind of rounded, and that they would have a series of ropes attached near the top, and they would be rocked back and forth, and the bottom would be shifted forward as that happened. So if you can imagine moving something very heavy like a refrigerator by yourself, you often kind of move one side and move the other. Walking a Moai would be very similar. This theory became very popular in the late 20th century. However, many modern art historians and archaeologists doubt that, because the Moai are made out of a relatively soft stone, and they argue that they would have been significantly worn away on the bottom by this process of rocking or dragging across the ground. Art historians and archaeologists who still believe this theory argue that they could have had a larger base left as part of the sculpture, which was intended to wear down over time.